Welcome to the latest episode of Ed Influence. I'm Nick McKenzie from Brown Jacobson, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Dan Kayne, founder of O-Shaped. Thank you, Dan, for joining me today. I suspect we'll come back to O-Shaped later, but I wanted to start by inviting you to tell me a story from your life that would give me a picture of who you are as a leader.
So I'm going to take you back 10 years or so, Nick, to when Oliver, my son, was born. I've got two kids, 10-year-old Oliver, 6-year-old Neve. And Oliver's born really ill, critically ill. He had a critical pulmonary stenosis, which is a serious and life-threatening problem with a heart valve. And he spent his first month in hospital, 3 weeks at Great Ormond Street. He was operated on day 4. And the surgeon that operated on him, that did an incredible, complex piece of surgery that to them is normal, but to us is kind of a whole new world of life experience and change, by inserting a catheter in his groin in order to inflate a balloon in the heart the size of a walnut to allow him to breathe. And when he explained the procedure to us, my wife and I, obviously in a very distressed state, he explained it so beautifully and so clearly and in a very compassionate and empathetic way, and then had to leave shortly after and said he apologized for leaving, but he had to go and conduct the same operation on a boy that was in the intensive care unit in the bed next to Oliver. And he kind of whisked off and left us with this kind of knowledge that he was our superhero. He'd saved Oliver's life and also ours, frankly. But it was really a year later when I started to really think about the impact that whole experience had had. And particularly on my own career, my own thinking about what is it I'm doing that's making a difference. And having been in the legal industry for 15 years already by then, I felt that it wasn't enough. And I felt that seeing what some people were able to do, both technically as well as from a very much a compassionate point of view, was a real eye-opener for me about what's the impact, what's the purpose that I'm going to have when it comes to leadership in the future. And it was such a life-changing period of time. And it has been really the precursor to everything that I do now.
So how does that show up for you now then in terms of what you're doing, Dan? That probably nicest leads us into what you're doing now.
Well, now as founder of O-Shaped and running an organization that's tagline is people first. And it's much more, I think, and I hope, than a tagline. It's really about how do we bring humanity into the legal profession and make it part of our everyday work. But the reason why it was linked to that, I think, was my recognition that as a profession, we'd got it wholly wrong. We'd got it, I think, in the space where technical excellence was considered the be-all and end-all. And what I'd seen from something in a much more critical environment, a terminal environment, was that you could combine that technical excellence, that cardiology excellence, with compassion, with humanity, with the warmth that was required to help my wife and I through a traumatic period. But that was so important. And Great Ormond Street, I think, epitomized that the heart and smart, as I've later called it, and borrowed that phrase, I should say, from a book I read, is so fundamental to a legal profession and it excelling within the legal profession, that it was that moment when I realized we need to start building a legal profession that recognizes it can't just be about being really, really intelligent and smart. It's got to be about the heart as well. And I think that really laid the foundation for me, not immediately, but over time, as these ideas percolated, to say, how can we start thinking of a legal profession that is both hearts and smarts, that rewards and recognizes the emotional intelligence as much as the cognitive intelligence, that we now start to look at people who are able to lead with empathy and passion and regard them as being genuine leaders, as opposed to simply rewarding those who bring the most fees in or who are technically the smartest. And that's a cultural and fundamental shift that perhaps when I first started out, Nick, I thought, oh, it'll be a doddle. Turns out it's not, but it's one that I think gets me out of bed every morning to try and address. So that's probably the way in which over time it's linked.
So was really interested, speaking to you today to understand. My understanding is O-Shape started off as a passion project, and then you decided to take the leap and go all in my words. What made you do that?
It's funny because it's become such an important part of you. I did it as a side of the desk project O-Shaped when it started. I started to develop thinking about creating the team I was then leading. I was a General Counsel soon after that experience. And I started thinking, how can I bring some of that humanity, that people first approach, as we termed it, to our day jobs? And so I started to build a team with that ethos very much front and center, that we're going to get to understand people better. We're going to empathize, not just from my own team's needs, but those of our stakeholders in the organization. And we're going to really understand what they care about, because that will help us deliver a better service as a legal provider to them. And once I started to realize that many other in-house teams shared this challenge about connecting with colleagues around the business, delivering a great legal service, that it not just being about being the smartest person in the room, I realized that there was something more here than simply from our team or just a few teams or just an idea that will hang around for a bit and be a fad and disappear. So it started to become a kind of side of the desk project that during COVID really started to blossom. And COVID was really almost the catalyst for it, because it had the potential to remove all of what I valued so much, the human connection, and put us behind screens. And yet what it did do was actually have the opposite effect. It started to open up people, their homes, looking at it through Zoom. It started to get people thinking about well-being in a different way. People would start conversations about how are you, how are your family, are you struggling with what's going on? Mentally, it might be quite challenging. Physically, for people, getting out the door once in a day for an hour was kind of a struggle for those who loved the gym. So you started talking much more about people's interests and not just their work. And so the humanity actually, I think, started to become more of a focal point during COVID than what I worried about was it being the opposite. And so people started thinking and linking O-Shaped much more to what people are experiencing during COVID. And I realized then that this human connection wasn't just a luxury. It wasn't just a side of the desk project anymore. This was how people went about their lives and ultimately how they felt most passionately about their work when they connected with people. And yet it was such an anathema to the legal industry until COVID that you could be successful by putting people front and center, that once we came out of COVID, O-Shaped had already become a really well-known concept. And it was something that was so embedded in me and never felt like work, that to do it full-time as work was just such a natural progression. I'm not suggesting it was an easy mental decision to make, but from I've got to do this, that was easy bit.
Really interested in that dynamic. Would you say it required you courage to take the step to do it? Or I'm interested of, lots are obviously at stake. You had a successful career, and to go into something you really believed in. I mean, it really comes across strongly in terms of the amount of times you've mentioned humanity, and it's clearly important to you.
Yeah.
Or was it just such an obvious thing that you wanted to do that it didn't feel like you needed to be courageous?
It's a good question, actually, Nick, because I never felt of it as courageous, but others perhaps looking outside in did. Because again, we've come from a very institutionalized environment. When you come through the legal profession, many like me, certainly of my generation, would have gone through university, law school. I went to a big firm. I went in-house. I've never really experienced anything outside of that environment until I became a leader in-house, where I started to then explore all sorts of different opportunities outside of my swim lane. But for many who stay in the swim lane, that's seen as courageous. But by then, I'd already started doing lots of different interesting things within Network Rail that were outside of the legal sphere. So the desire to move into a different space was a very easy step to take. Much more difficult is the risk aversion that naturally I had, and I think had been built in me for years through my 25 plus years as a lawyer, was to say, well, what are all the things that are going to go wrong with this? The natural legal response, it's going to be, will I be able to fund it? Will I be able to ever be a lawyer if this fails again? Will I be so out of touch with the legal community no one will want to talk to me? You almost catastrophize. And so the best thing I did was talking to lots of people who had gone through the same thing. And I think that provided me a reassurance that many people said, what's the worst that can happen, right? You've been able to hold down a job before, you'll be able to hold down a job after. And it's clear if you don't do this, you're going to regret it forever. And I think that point about don't have any regrets was ultimately made it an easy decision, in truth.
And so I think you said that bringing the humanity into the provision of giving legal advice, at the start felt like an anathema. How did you go about sort of moving the dial on that, and the work I imagine you're still doing in terms of O-Shape? And I suppose, what have you learned along the way in terms of trying to move that dial?
I started to read up a lot about leadership and became very interested in a much more modern day progressive style of leadership around servant leadership, around empathetic leadership, which really chimed with me and what I was experiencing and trying to go through with my own team. And I'd been in organizations historically that were quite command and control style. And that just didn't sit with me in terms of enabling others to thrive. So I thought of my role as a leader as genuinely cared about my team. And I wanted to make sure that they had the opportunity to be the best versions of themselves. So that for me meant that it had to be much more about them as people and less than as them about lawyers. I had to understand and care about their worlds outside of giving great advice on procurement law or commercial contracts. I wanted to know about them, the person, and that automatically means you're bringing a much more human approach to your work. It also, I learned, means that you get the discretionary effort and the engagement and the motivation of people who you are leading because they're invested in you as well as their job. And if they are led by someone that they care about, that they see cares about them, it leads to a much happier and healthier working environment and ultimately a much more productive one. So I think drawing that link between engaged people, people that loved coming to work, people that felt like they were part of something, had a better business outcome anyway, because all of a sudden our colleagues, who I think were naysayers of the legal function in many respects when I joined as a leader in the legal function, were all of a sudden, what we found from our colleagues and stakeholders in the organization was that they were engaging with us differently, because all of a sudden we were showing that we cared about them and what they were delivering. And that was all about the relationships and the human connections and nothing about knowing the law inside out. Yes, of course, our legal expertise would follow, but people would now listen to us because they trusted us, because we had built that trust, and that's a human-to-human connection. And I think that messaging, that learning was something I was able to take and share with others that saw, do you know what, there is something in this, and not just has traditionally been seen as soft skills. I used to hate and still do that phrase that it's almost as if the law is the hardcore stuff and everything else is the soft add-on fluffy stuff. But making this mainstream, making human and business skills mainstream, for me was just as important as the technical, and we had to make people see that it would lead to a successful outcome. And that's the thing that we've had to, and I'm still having to do a lot of, is show this isn't just about being nice. This is about creating an environment where people thrive that leads to better business outcomes. And that's a hard message for an industry like the legal industry to grasp onto, I think.
I don't think it's exclusive to the legal industry, but time and time pressure. I mean, how many times do you hear people say, I haven't got enough hours in the day or enough time? But
Yeah.
that, I suppose, is a real counterweight to being human, finding the time to listen, to be genuinely interested and have those conversations. Is that a challenge, do you think?
Do you know what it is? And most of the teams we'll work with will say one of their biggest challenges is the amount of work they've got to do, right? It's particularly when you're working with in-house, because in private practice, in many respects, that's seen as a real positive. You know, we're really busy. That's great. That equals fees. But certainly in-house, the big challenge is too much work. But one of the things we talk about is if you can improve your relationships with your stakeholders internally that give you the work, and I think this applies to private practice as well, by the way, and we can come on to that. But if you have got a stronger connection and a better relationship, you're much more able to share when you've got too much work, when you feel like you're not going to be able to deliver the level of quality that your stakeholders are entitled to expect, because it's going to be compromised by the volume of work and your lack of capacity. They'll understand that, and they'll help you to focus on the priority. And of course, there's lots of noise from lots of different places, so you need lots of connections and people who will speak for you and support you. But for me, again, it comes down to that human connection. You will be able to address the prioritization and the struggles with the volume if you have relationships where you can be honest and open with people and tell them, do you know what, we need more time? Or actually, this isn't one we can do now, or we might not do at all. That's a lot easier coming from a place of trust than one of lack of trust. And I think the same applies to private practice, where a stronger relationship with the client means, do you know what, my team is really, really at full stretch now. If you can wait a week for that, we'll have it with you. But that's a really brave law firm that asks their client to wait a week, right? And yet we should be doing more of it. We should be doing more of it. And one of the things O-Shape's looking to try and do is bring, the law firm, we work, as you know, closely with Brown Jacobson, in partnership with Brown Jacobson, to bring Brown Jacobson colleagues together with client colleagues and have these conversations, because no one wants anyone to get hurt in their job. No one wants anyone to fall over in their job. And in fact, I think everyone wants each other to thrive. That's genuinely how most people I speak to feel and think. So why not make it easier for each other rather than harder?
Yeah, it strikes me as a very human conversation you were saying there between law firm and client. Perhaps switching tact a little bit, I was wondering what's on your mind this week. What are the sort of things? I recognise this is going out publicly, so maybe limits, but what are the sorts of things you're thinking about?
So I've got this constant thought that goes through my mind about nearly 2 years into O-Shape now, and actually that's why timely this week. Next week will be 2 years, Easter, exactly 2 years. Is what does the future hold for O-Shaped, and what does it mean for the profession, and how can we show impact? And it's been great to gain the traction that O-Shaped has. And I've loved being able to talk to brilliant people about something I really care about, and I hope inspire people along the way as well. But for O-Shape to exist and thrive in the future and hopefully inspire many more people, we've got to make sure that we are having an impact and demonstrate that impact. And at the moment, this week I've done a lot of reflection on how do we know that all of the time and effort we're putting in is ultimately helping us to achieve our purpose to make the legal profession better for those who are in it, those who use it, and those who are entering it. And can I say hand on heart, at the moment, I could show you that, Nick? No. Do I want to be able to show you that next year if we have this conversation again? Absolutely, I do. And I feel like we are doing it, but it's very hard to show it. And that's been taking a lot of my mental gymnastics this week, trying to get my head around it.
I can see that. That's it's a great vision and mission you've got, but I think we all struggle sometimes with we feel it, but actually being able to demonstrate it externally is a challenge. So I look forward to seeing how you get on with that over the next year in terms of articulating it. How much time do you make to think as a leader, Dan?
I always made time for it, even when I was in the day job as a lawyer. I think I make more of it now. So just taking you back, one of the things that I remember doing as a first team meeting, when I had the first group of people together as a GC, and I'd been mentally kind of going through that first meeting beforehand, because it was quite a big milestone. All of a sudden you've reached the kind of pinnacle of where, the in-house role I thought I might reach. And there were 25 or so people then in those days sitting around a room table, and having the opportunity to be able to set the tone for the future. And I asked a question and posed something to the table, and there was deathly silence. And one person piped up and said, you've probably been thinking about that question a lot. We haven't had time to think about that question. And yet you're expecting us to be able to give you a response straight away. And I thought it was a really interesting and useful challenge back, because sometimes you forget when you are in that leadership position and you do think regularly about your impact on others and your success as a leader and a function of a team. You want the rest of your team to think that way, but they're far too busy to. And it was quite an eye-opener for me to now take a step back next time and hopefully bridge that gap first before I posed a question like I did last time. And I think that was a good lesson for me, and it's now is something I think about regularly. Is I do think through a lot of the issues that we're talking about regularly. I do think about what good leadership looks like in our profession and more broadly. Do I think about my own leadership style as much? No. And do I always practice what I preach? Probably not, but I want to get better at that. But I do think about it quite a lot.
Yeah, that observation, something similar has fed back to me recently. You can ask a question like that, and it can be personality driven, or it can be such a weighty question. Anyone would want the time to properly reflect before answering it. So I can really connect with that, Dan. Interested, Anne Lim, who was one of earlier guests on this series, she talked about the power of quiet influence in leadership. And I was just wondering whether you could share your observations, either what you've seen work well for others or what you've done yourself in terms of making those decisions in terms of when to lead using influence and when to actually use the formal power that sort of goes with the leadership role.
Yeah, and no one's really ever accused me of quiet influence. There's no doubt about that. I think when I was the General Counsel and had the side project, it doesn't feel like the right phrase, but was certainly a passion project on the side of the desk at the time with O'Shea. That for me was where I was quite proud that we were making some progress with the in-house community in particular, because there was no authority there whatsoever. So I had no power. And yet being able to lead without authority for me was an even more, I think, proud moment, that people then were influenced because they believed in your vision and your passion for something, as opposed to we've got to do it because Dan's our boss. That for me is a wholly different level of leadership. And I'm still most proud of that. And in fact, I still sometimes pinch myself when I think about how much time people are voluntarily giving to push forward the O-shaped messaging and movement. And, for me going forward, I want to now make sure others can take this on without me at all, right? So could O-shaped carry on with what it's trying to do without me? At the moment, probably not. But is that where I want to get to? Yes, I'd love to get to that. Now, that means I need to be, I think, being able to allow others even more responsibility to go out and take it forward. So I have to, the more I can relinquish control, the better it will be for the movement for change. And that in itself is quite a significant leadership leap that I'm not sure I'm even ready to make yet, because it's kind of like, it's your baby, right? I've nurtured it for 5 years, and yes, it's got legs still to go somewhere, but ultimately it will only achieve that grand vision if I allow it to go.
I was really interested in your bio. You describe, and on your website, you described yourself as a founder, Dan, and there's obviously other titles you could have used, and it felt like there might be something in that. Could you describe how you came on wanting to be called founder rather than something else? It feels like it could be important.
Yeah, I really struggled with what to call myself, because I've only ever been a lawyer, general counsel, and then all of a sudden you've now got to call yourself something that's meaningful to other people. And it was really, just not having that title of general counsel I felt would be a really significant step. So much so that even on my LinkedIn profile now, I still have general counsel written on there somewhere. It's very hard to let go. But it starts founder O-shaped, then general counsel. And I think it's founder because the immediate alternative was CEO. And I never felt that I was chief executive of anything, frankly. And at the time, being me as just the only officer, it felt wrong to call myself the chief effectively officer. And there's no executive. So it felt it wasn't necessarily the right title. Founder is broad enough, I think, hopefully for people to ask a bit more, to be curious. And I hope over time I'll move away from founder, because founder kind of suggests it's very much in startup mode, right? That's my feeling of it. I'm sure that's not necessarily true factually, but it feels when you put founder, it's a bit startup-y. It's a little bit disruptive. And I hope that we'll get to the stage where we'll always have that element of disruptiveness about us, but we'll be substantial and significant enough that we'll have a CEO, whether it's me or someone else in the future, we'll have a CEO that is overseeing an executive that is driving change across the profession. That would be great, but I just think it's too early yet for me to see myself as a CEO. The title has never been, for me, the determining factor. It's been about how can we make people feel like the O-shaped is for them, as opposed to it's about me. And I'm not sure I get that balance right often enough, because I've still got, however much I want to share that sense of O-shaped, I still kind of have this, I don't know, this sense of, I love talking about it so much. So to not be the person on stage talking about it, I've not quite got my head around that yet. And I'm working on that.
I was just thinking there, you mentioned disruption, and even when you felt like you were more advanced in what you were trying to achieve, and perhaps having the articulation of the impact that you were describing a moment ago. Why is disruption important to you?
As I've never been a fan of the status quo. I just think the status quo is a bit bland. I think too many times, maybe again, it's just become institutionalized through what we've done for so long, but people doing what they've always done and don't push things because it's the way it's done around here just irritated me. And I've always kind of thought, can we not do it a bit better? Can we not even just take that little thing and make it a bit smarter? But again, when you're in the fairly traditional environment that we've grown up in, that frankly is very successful when money is your measure of success, why do you need to tinker with something? If it ain't broke, just leave it alone. And that's frustrated me, because I think as a buyer of legal service, I thought it is a bit broken. And then I thought, when I started running O-shaped, actually there's lots of our profession that's very broken. Why should we just accept that? So I like to be a bit of an agitator for change, to stimulate different conversations, to encourage people to think a little bit more broadly, take that step back and say, can we do things better? We know we can, frankly, everyone can. But for people to feel like they are the solution as opposed to someone else will solve it, And I was always in that place of, yeah, this isn't right. That's not right. Someone needs to do this. They need to address that. And it was only when I realized that I am they, that I thought, you know what, if you don't get up and do it, then no one else will. So I think that's where the disruptor bit comes in. I want to see it as a positive disruptor, not someone's just coming in to disrupt for the sake of it, but to disrupt for a good reason, I think is a title I'm comfortable with.
Thank you. In a while ago, you were describing elements of, I think, what you probably call followership.
Yeah.
Followership. I was curious, is there a leader that you followed? And if there is, what was it that sort of attracted you? Why did you follow them?
As I was making my way through the profession, I didn't see anyone that really inspired me, right? In within that environment I was in. And it was really only when I left what I felt was a very cosseted bubble of big law and moved outside and saw the bigger, wider world did I start to see people who genuinely inspired me. And that would be people, whether it was at Network Rail or whether it was at other generally corporates I saw rather than law firms I dealt with, watching people, particularly people who spoke publicly and spoke publicly really articulately without any notes, who were able just to capture the audience's attention. That for me was something I found inspirational. Being able to hold an audience of hundreds of people and they were all quiet and they were all hanging off every word you said. That for me was something I really looked up to as being incredible. And feeling that someone could have so much power or influence just by the words they're using, that for me is a real sign of leadership. And I think that has led me to, in part, to where I am now and what I do today, because I love talking to people. I'm not always as articulate as the people I've had in mind that I'm thinking of now, but I've seen the power and influence that you can have by words. And I think that for me is really inspirational.
An effective leader is a storyteller. Does that resonate?
100%. One of the former directors, a comms director many years ago at Network Rail, was leaving, and I had a session with him before he left, a kind of just a download, and I was asking about career development. We're going back some time, and he was a senior executive, and he said to me, "You've really, from what we've talked about, I don't know your story well enough. I think you need to learn how to tell your story better." And storytelling has become, I think, one of my strengths, I hope, as a result, not just of that conversation, but seeing great people on stage and the way they describe it. It's a brilliant influencer when you're trying to get your message across and build trust. And one of our key attributes is around influence and trust with O-Shape. But it's not something that has ever focused on enough in our industry, even though we say our role as legal advisors is to influence outcomes. Well, we've done it traditionally by telling people the law, and almost as a, if you don't do this, you will suffer bad things, as opposed to creating the narrative and the storytelling as to helping to make your case. And look, you look at the very best orators, whether in our own profession, barristers, they're brilliant storytellers. And it's massively influential when you hear people who are very good at it. So it's a long-winded answer to, is it important? Yes. Have I seen it work? Absolutely. Do I think we should do more training of it in our profession? Yes.
I was wondering whether you could share some of the reflections on what you've done either at Network Rail or indeed in the organisation you created in O-Shape to really go about fostering belonging at your organisation. Because I think it's a real, you talked about the pandemic earlier as well, and it's sort of changing the dynamic. And I suppose you were describing about vulnerability and people being seeing into each other's lives much more. Be really interested in your observations on what you're doing and what you've done in the past.
I think the messaging of people first was a real marker in the sand for belonging, Nick. It didn't go down with everyone brilliantly. Lawyer first, it was people first, then lawyer, because people said, actually, no, we're here because we're lawyers. And it took a while to convince people, actually, look, you're great at being a lawyer. Let's focus on the person. But one of the things I did, I felt that landed quite well, and we started doing more regularly after, and it may be something people do already or should take up, was in one of the first team meetings, not perhaps the first team meeting where I lost that person by not giving them clarity over the question, but one of them we had a me on the page. So everyone came with a one-page printout that they presented to everyone else about what they cared about, right, in life. That was it. There was no other particular direction. What do you really care about? So people told their story, their life story in within 5 minutes, about their family, about what they're passionate about, the charities they work for. And what was incredible was 50% of people gave up time to charity in our team of 25 that no one knew. Not everyone knew. People said, oh, I know they've done an hour for that charity. So all of a sudden, you're now building connections with people who have got things in common they didn't realize they had in common. So I think being able to use that opportunity for people to share what they care about is a brilliant way of connecting others to something you're passionate about. So most for me of the belonging doesn't come from the being in the same office, and it can't really now because of remote working, but it comes from drawing links between what people are passionate about. And so one of the ways that we emphasized that was constantly to be going round time and again as to who hasn't done their what I care about on a page for a year or 18 months. Let's do it again, right? It's okay if we've heard it before, that's fine. But we'll have a new person in the team that won't have done. So let's spend the time. And to some people, that might have been frustrating because, you know what, we know that you like working for that charity. But what you then find is the person that's just come in new to the team would say, oh, such and such works there, don't they? And all of a sudden they've built a connection. So the new person to the team feels like they're part of it already. So I think that for me was a really useful way of authentically being able to create a belonging environment. And the other one that I didn't know it was called at the time, but psychological safety is one I've really warmed to since I've been working with the O-shaped approach. I just saw it as creating an environment where everyone felt like they could contribute, speak up, that they would have a voice. And now, since being much more involved with O-shaped and leadership and being really and embracing, psychological safety from Amy Emson's work, I've realized actually that's what we were doing. I've realized actually we were allowing people the space and time to contribute regardless of their level of hierarchy, that then made people want to come to work. And I've had, as I'm sure many of your listeners have, I've had the Sunday blues in previous jobs where I just didn't want to go to work on the Monday morning. And that's a place I never want to get to again. And I used to say that to team members who are struggling at times. And I said, if this isn't the right place for you, if you feel like that, then I will help you find somewhere that is right for you. And if that's not here, that's fine. And it had to happen a couple of times. And that's okay, because that's not to say the person isn't brilliant. It's to say that he or she wasn't suitable for this environment, or I couldn't get the most out of him or her. So in that sense, identifying where people didn't belong and being able to help them find somewhere that they did belong was just as important, if that makes sense. Because you can't be all things to all people. And I think that's one of the things I learned quite quickly about leadership. I tried to please everyone all the time, thinking that was your job as a leader, and it's not. So I hope that people who work with me felt a sense of belonging, and that I helped those that struggled with it. And that, for me, I think hope is a legacy that I'd like to be able to look back on and see as an impact. And talk, coming back to this point about impact, it needs to be something tangible.
We're nearly out of time. Just probably two last questions. Could you complete the following sentence for me? An effective leader is
someone who cares about their followers.
Brilliant. And what quality do you see in your children that you wish you had?
they have such different qualities. I mean, Oliver is autistic, and so in him I see a real sense of curiosity that I think I never had. You just take things for granted, whereas he doesn't. And some of the questions he asks are incredibly insightful that I don't think others would ask. And I think that sense of curiosity is brilliant, not just assuming that everything is as it is, it's the asking the why. And I think for Neve, because she's such a force of nature, I think her at her age at 6, to have the confidence that she does is, and it's not overstepping the mark, it's confidence that others then really kind of energize from, is brilliant. And I hope that now I've got some of both of those things, but to have them then, absolutely incredible. So we learn off them every day. Absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I've thoroughly enjoyed our discussion. Thank you for being so candid and sharing so openly. And I do hope our listeners have enjoyed the discussion as well.
Thanks, Nick, for having me.